Contractors supporting the Department of Homeland Security are navigating a mix of shifting reviews, uneven funding streams, and slow reimbursements for work already completed. Those delays are now rippling through companies that don't get upfront payments and rely on predictable cash flows to keep projects moving. We break down what's driving the bottlenecks and who's feeling it most with Stephanie Kostro, Executive Vice President for Policy at the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Terry.
As we are speaking, the Department of Homeland Security is in another shutdown. Let's talk about not specifically how we're going to get out of this, but what does it mean for the companies who are in the business of supporting the Department of Homeland Security? All this ups and downs, ins and outs. What does it mean day to day?
That is a fantastic question, Terry, because a lot of the media, since the shutdown started just a few days ago, has focused a lot on which federal workers are being furloughed, who's deemed essential or exempt from the furlough, right? And those numbers are interesting, very, very interesting to all of us. One thing, though, that we have to keep in mind is parts of DHS do have funding. And some of that funding came from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was signed last summer. And it provided DHS with almost $200 billion of funding, a lot of it for ICE, some for Customs and Border Protection, et cetera. So they still have some money in the coffers. And so we would see that ICE agents, for example, or CBP agents or officers are still out there and they're getting paid. But a lot of folks who are working in the federal workforce, we're going to have to wait for their paychecks. On the contractor side, those paychecks are a little bit more in question. And I say that because, one, federal employees are guaranteed back pay. So when the shutdown ends, in this case for DHS, all federal workers, whether they were furloughed or not, are going to get paid. There is no similar law on the books for contractors. And so a lot of times when we enter a shutdown, there will be stop work orders, business grinds to a halt. You don't have the access to the facilities, so you can't get into the buildings, et cetera. So that puts a lot of strain on contractors. And there are two different lines of thinking here, Terry. And one is, how does this impact business planning for contractors? How do they do their workforce development? How do they think about their pipeline of work when they've been issued a stop work order or, proposals are not being accepted? The other piece is, how do they get paid for work that's already done? They've submitted invoices and everything comes to a halt. So those are the two major areas, Terry, that we are tracking very closely during this shutdown.
Well, this uncertainty goes way back to last fall and the shutdown at the beginning of the fiscal year in October, which was the longest we've had, and then some short-term funding. Now we're off again, and there's no certainty as to when this will start up.
To say this is fits and starts is an understatement. It was, as you mentioned, a historically long, it was a 43-day government shutdown for agencies, including DHS. Now DHS is facing an uncertain timeline as well. Congress is due back on February 23rd. They are subject to the recall of the speaker. The speaker can have folks come back. He said he would give them 48 hours notice, but that's only if a deal is on the table. And I don't think they're working on this currently, at least in a visible way right now. So really what we're looking at when Congress comes back on the 23rd, but they still need to hammer out their issues. And so this work stoppage for contractors who are affected, as well as this uncertainty, this fits and starts piece. We talk a lot with contractors, specifically the small ones, about access to capital, making sure that they can retain their workforce during this period of uncertainty. It does throw a lot of angst into the system, Terry.
Part of another spoon that's stirring this pot is that Secretary Noem is still personally reviewing every contract over $100,000. What sort of wrinkle does that present?
Terry, I'm so glad you asked about this, because this policy of the Secretary of Homeland Security reviewing anything that's $100,000 or more, whether it's a grant or a contract, has really thrown more uncertainty into the mix. As you said, it's an additional spoon stirring the pot. It's funny to think, the policy says, the Secretary reviews these things pretty quickly and approves them or disapproves them. Our experience is that not that it's taking 5 days for this to happen. It's in excess of 90 days in some instances, because these packages have to be put together. Everybody in the acquisition workforce who has looked at the package will say it's fine, and then it sits before its final hurdle. And it could be that the review team, before it passes it on to the secretary, needs an additional few weeks, few months more time. My understanding is that they're only passing up packages to her that for her approval, that if it's going to be disapproved, they're continuing to gather more documentation. But this adds so much uncertainty in terms of timelines. You think as a contractor, you've cleared all the hurdles with your acquisition workforce, and then it kind of sits for a little while. And you don't have a lot of insight into the process. You'd offer more information if it was helpful, but you don't know what information is missing from the review team's perspective. And so there is a lot of angst in the works. And I'll give you one anecdote, Terry. It's something our boss at PSC, our Chief Executive Officer, Jim Carroll, likes to say, is that you talk to the Customs and Border Protection guys, their quarterly coffee budget exceeds $100,000. So almost everything of import is really going to exceed that threshold. So it means the secretary is looking at every single dollar that's going out the door.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Kostro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, let's go back now to something you mentioned at the beginning, the delay in payments as a result of all of this uncertainty in funding. Is it in? Is it out? Is it, how long is it going to last? How are contractors being reimbursed for work that they've performed?
That's also a great question, Terry. What differentiates one way a grant is different than a contract is in many cases, a grant, you get the money up front and then you burn through it doing the work that you were hired to do. For a contract, it's oftentimes that you're getting reimbursed for work that's already done. So you've already made payments to your employees or for the supplies or components that you need for your solution, et cetera. And then you submit an invoice to the government. And I'll give you two examples here where we've run into some issues. That we at PSC have 400 member companies, and a lot of them work for DHS and a lot of them work for State Department. So those are the two areas I want to highlight here. For DHS, my understanding is that a lot goes through the ICE Consolidated Payment Center, where the Consolidated Payment Center takes in invoices and then passes them over to be validated by the customer within the Department of Homeland Security. And that customer says, yes, the work has been done to our satisfaction, and there is enough funding in this fund site to pay for the invoice. That process, in some cases, just to go from ICE receiving the invoice to it going to the office in order to be validated, is taking in excess of a month. And so this is running afoul a little bit of the Prompt Payment Act, which says once you've accepted an invoice, and that's the process we're trying to get to, the validated invoice, you have 30 days to pay the invoice itself without incurring interest payments as the government. So we are running into a lot of cases where this process is so bogged down that small businesses, medium-sized businesses are waiting eagerly for the ICE Consolidated Payment Center at DHS to pass it along to the customer and be validated. The customer is waiting for it too. They want to validate the invoice and get the money out the door, but there has been some issues. And I know ICE is busy lately. They have other things on their plate, but the payments of contractors is really what helps keep small businesses afloat. On the State Department side, PSC did send Secretary Rubio a letter. We gathered information from some dozen or so of our member companies who had performed work a year ago before contracts were canceled, but also who have negotiated termination settlement proposals. And they are owed a reimbursement collectively in excess of $600 million. And so we are trying to work with the State Department to understand better how these companies can get reimbursed for work already performed. That's money that really goes to American workers. And we have every interest in making sure they can put food on the table and gas in their cars.
Stephanie, is PSC concerned at all that businesses who have been in this space will just decide that this environment is too hard to work in and leave the space? I mean, a lot of time you hear there, we leave one and we'll get another one, but it's not quite so easy.
That's exactly, I would say it's not just what we're concerned about, it's what we're seeing in some cases where companies are deciding federal work is just too hard. They're not getting paid money that they should be reimbursed for. And they're pivoting to either work in the international community or for state and local governments, or they're just going over to the commercial side and they're getting out of government work. And so I do think it's not easy to reconstitute that body of knowledge that makes up the federal marketplace. Contractors are partners to the federal government. They want to achieve missions for the American people as much as federal civilians and military folks want to do it. And I would really love to keep them in this space. They're folks with clearances or they hold positions of public trust, law enforcement, et cetera, or the civilians who help on the backside or in the back offices there. I would hate to see contractors depart this federal marketplace because of a situation like this, just because they're not getting paid or it's not as certain a marketplace as they thought it would be.
How are you engaging with federal leaders to help them understand the ramifications of some of these decisions?
We have some great conversations with folks, whether it's at the White House or in the departments and agencies and on the Hill, to be honest, about the importance of the federal workforce, civilians, military, and contractors alike, and making sure that we have a robust ecosystem where we are all partners working towards the same federal mission set for the American people. And we are talking to them about how to make the marketplace more attractive for retention of companies, but also for new entrants. I mean, they do, as a whole, want to attract more people to the federal marketplace, so there are more options. You can have cost competitions, et cetera. So we are engaging quite a bit on all fronts on this, just to highlight the importance that we bring to the table as contractors.
I've been speaking with Stephanie Kostro. She's president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.